The fluorescent lights of courtroom 7B hummed with their usual sterile indifference as 32-year-old Adrian Foster stood before the bench, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of the defendant's table. The judge peered down at him with barely concealed disdain, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose as she shuffled through the case files. To her, this was just another criminal standing before her, another young man caught in the system, likely guilty of whatever charges the prosecutor had leveled against him. But what neither the judge nor anyone else in that packed courtroom knew was that a single DNA test, ordered almost as an afterthought 3 months prior, was about to shatter everything they thought they understood about this case. Adrian's court-appointed attorney, a tired-looking woman named Teresa Yang, sat beside him with a manila envelope that seemed to pulse with significance. She had received the lab results only that morning, and the color had drained from her face as she'd read them in her cramped office downtown. Now, as the proceedings began, she knew that within minutes this routine hearing would transform into something unprecedented. The charges against Adrian were serious. He stood accused of breaking into the home of a prominent businessman named Gregory Whitmore and assaulting him during an alleged robbery attempt. The evidence seemed straightforward. Security footage showed a figure matching Adrian's build, eyewitness testimony from Whitmore himself, and Adrian's fingerprints found on a basement window. Adrian had maintained his innocence from the moment of his arrest 6 months ago, insisting he'd never been to Whitmore's estate in the wealthy Oakmont Hills neighborhood, but his protestations had fallen on deaf ears. He was a former foster kid with a spotty employment history and a past misdemeanor for shoplifting when he was 19. To the system, he fit a familiar profile. Judge Victoria Brennan cleared her throat, preparing to move through what she assumed would be a straightforward plea hearing. "Mr. Foster," she began, her voice carrying that particular tone of weary judgment that comes from years on the bench. "You stand accused of first-degree burglary and aggravated assault. How do you plead?" Before Adrian could speak, Teresa Yang stood abruptly. "Your Honor, if I may, the defense has received critical evidence that fundamentally alters the nature of this case. We request an immediate recess to present these findings." Judge Brennan's expression soured. "Ms. Yang, we've been over this. Your client had ample opportunity during discovery to—" "Your Honor," Teresa interrupted, her voice stronger now, "this involves DNA evidence that only arrived this morning. Evidence that proves my client's innocence beyond any shadow of doubt." A murmur rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor, a sharp-featured man named Calvin Hughes, rose from his seat with visible irritation. "Your Honor, this is clearly a delay tactic. The defense has had months to—" "The DNA results weren't available until today," Teresa cut in, "and they tell a story that this court needs to hear." Judge Brennan removed her glasses, rubbing the bridge of her nose. She'd seen every trick in the book during her 15 years on the bench, and she was skeptical. But something in Teresa Yang's voice gave her pause. "This had better be substantive, Counselor. Approach the bench, both of you." As the two attorneys walked forward, Adrian remained standing, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He glanced back at the gallery, where his foster sister, Naomi Reeves, sat in the third row. She was the only family he had left, the only person who had believed him through this nightmare. She gave him an encouraging nod, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears. At the bench, Teresa handed over the envelope containing the lab results. Judge Brennan opened it, her eyes scanning the technical jargon and findings. Calvin Hughes leaned in to read over her shoulder, his expression shifting from annoyance to confusion to something approaching alarm. "This can't be right," Hughes muttered, his prosecutorial confidence wavering for the first time in the case. "It's been verified by 2 independent labs," Teresa said quietly. "The DNA found under Mr. Whitmore's fingernails, skin cells from the alleged assault, it doesn't match my client, but it does match someone else, someone already in the system." Judge Brennan's face had gone pale as she continued reading. The document revealed that the DNA belonged to a man named Elliot Whitmore, Gregory Whitmore's own son, who had supposedly been out of state during the time of the incident. More than that, further testing had revealed something even more disturbing. Gregory Whitmore's injuries had been self-inflicted, staged to look like an assault. The biological evidence was irrefutable. "Your Honor," Teresa continued, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing, "my client has been imprisoned for 6 months for a crime that never actually occurred. Mr. Whitmore filed a false report, and his son helped stage the entire scene. We believe this was done to collect on an insurance policy for trauma and to deflect from financial improprieties in Mr. Whitmore's business dealings." Calvin Hughes seemed to be processing this information in real time, his carefully constructed case crumbling around him. "Your Honor, I had no knowledge of this. The evidence we presented was based on what we were given by—" "I understand, Mr. Hughes," Judge Brennan said, her voice tight. She looked down at Adrian Foster with new eyes, seeing perhaps for the first time not just another criminal, but a human being who had been catastrophically wronged by the very system meant to protect him. She returned to her seat, and the attorneys stepped back. The courtroom had fallen into an expectant silence. Judge Brennan took a long moment to compose herself before speaking. "Mr. Foster, please remain standing." Her voice had changed. The dismissive edge had vanished, replaced by something Adrian couldn't quite identify. "Ms. Yang, I'm going to ask you to present your findings to the court, all of them." What followed was 45 minutes that would later be described by court reporters as one of the most dramatic hearings in the county's history. Teresa Yang methodically laid out how Adrian had been framed. She explained that Gregory Whitmore, facing investigation by federal authorities for fraud in his commercial real estate business, had conspired with his son Elliot to stage a home invasion. They had deliberately chosen Adrian as their scapegoat, a young man with no resources to mount a proper defense, whose background made him an easy target for suspicion. The DNA evidence showed that Elliot Whitmore had been present at the scene, despite claiming he was in Chicago. His skin cells were found under his father's fingernails because Gregory had scratched him while they staged the assault. The basement window where Adrian's fingerprints had been found. Adrian had actually been there 3 months before the alleged crime, doing electrical work as part of a temp job. Whitmore had kept that detail out of his police report. As Teresa spoke, Adrian felt something fundamental shifting inside him. For 6 months, he had been treated like garbage, by the police, by the prosecutors, by the guards at the county jail, even by the judge herself. He had been presumed guilty because of who he was and where he came from. The justice system hadn't failed him. It had actively worked against him. Calvin Hughes, to his credit, stood and addressed the court with visible discomfort. "Your Honor, in light of these findings, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Foster immediately. We will be opening an investigation into Gregory and Elliot Whitmore for fraud, filing false reports, and perjury." Judge Brennan nodded slowly. "Motion granted. Mr. Foster, on behalf of this court, I must tell you that a grave injustice has been done to you. The charges against you are dismissed with prejudice." She paused, and for a moment her judicial composure cracked. "I owe you an apology. I judged you before hearing all the evidence. That is inexcusable." The courtroom erupted. Reporters who had been slouching in the back rows suddenly scrambled for their phones and laptops. Naomi burst into tears. Teresa Yang put a hand on Adrian's shoulder as he stood there, processing what had just happened. But Adrian didn't move. He didn't celebrate. He simply stood there, looking up at the judge, who had dismissed him as just another criminal, and said quietly, "Thank you, Your Honor, but an apology doesn't give me back 6 months of my life." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Judge Brennan nodded, accepting the rebuke. "No, Mr. Foster, it does not. You're free to go." Adrian walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, Naomi at his side, and Teresa Yang trailing behind them, already fielding calls from reporters. The fresh air felt foreign after months of recycled jail atmosphere. Everything looked sharper, more vivid, almost overwhelming. "I can't believe it's over," Naomi said, wiping her eyes. She was 35, 3 years older than Adrian, and had been his rock since they'd both aged out of the foster system. She worked double shifts as a home health aide to help pay for his legal defense, even though Teresa was court-appointed. "Adrian, you're free." "Am I, though?" Adrian asked, his voice hollow. "I lost my apartment, lost my job. Everyone I knew thinks I'm guilty. They're not going to see this news." Teresa caught up to them on the courthouse steps. "Adrian, we need to talk about next steps. You have grounds for a substantial civil lawsuit against Gregory Whitmore. False imprisonment, defamation, malicious prosecution. We could be looking at millions in damages." Adrian laughed bitterly. "Millions? From a guy who's about to be indicted for fraud. You think he's got millions lying around?" "The insurance companies might be liable too," Teresa pressed. "This is far from over. What was done to you? It's criminal, and there need to be consequences." He looked at her, this exhausted public defender who had actually believed him when no one else did. "Why did you keep pushing? You could have just had me take a plea deal like everyone wanted." Teresa's expression softened. "Because you looked me in the eye on day one and told me the truth, and because I'm tired of watching innocent people get ground up by a system that's supposed to protect them." She handed him her business card. "Take a few days, process this, but call me when you're ready to fight back." As Teresa walked away, Adrian and Naomi stood on the courthouse steps, watching the city move around them. Naomi linked her arm through his. "Come on. Let's get you home." "Well, to my place anyway." "I don't even know where to start," Adrian admitted. "How do I just go back to normal life after this?" "You don't," Naomi said simply. "You start a new life, a better one." They took the bus back to Naomi's small apartment in the Riverside district, a working-class neighborhood where everyone knew each other's business. When they arrived, there was already a small gathering of neighbors in the cramped living room. Naomi had called ahead with the news, and these people, mostly other folks from the foster system who had aged out and formed their own chosen family, had come to welcome Adrian home. There was Terrence Jackson, who worked at the warehouse where Adrian used to have a job before his arrest. There was Nina Santos, who ran the corner store and had known both Adrian and Naomi since they were teenagers. And there was Pastor William Graham from the community church, who had visited Adrian twice in jail, even though Adrian wasn't particularly religious. "Welcome back, son," Pastor Graham said, pulling Adrian into an unexpected hug. "We never stopped believing in you." The evening passed in a blur of conversation, food, and the strange sensation of being treated like a human being again. But Adrian found himself pulled between gratitude and rage. These people had stood by him, yes, but the system had tried to destroy him, and how many others like him weren't lucky enough to have DNA evidence that proved their innocence. Later that night, after everyone had left, Adrian sat on Naomi's couch with a beer in his hand, his first in 6 months, staring at nothing. "You're thinking too much," Naomi observed, sitting down beside him. "I'm thinking about Gregory Whitmore," Adrian said, "about how he looked at me across that courtroom like I was nothing, like I was just a convenient pawn in whatever game he was playing." He took a long drink. "How many times has he done this before? How many other people has he hurt? The police will investigate. The same police who arrested me without questioning his story. The same system that locked me up for 6 months before even bothering to check the DNA." Adrian shook his head. "No, this isn't over, Naomi. Not by a long shot." The next morning, Adrian made a decision. He called Teresa Yang and told her he wanted to pursue every legal avenue available. Not just a civil suit, but a full criminal investigation into everything Gregory Whitmore had done. Teresa connected him with a private investigator named Raymond Cho, a former police detective who had left the force after becoming disillusioned with corruption. Raymond met Adrian at a diner near the courthouse, a weathered man in his 50s with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He listened to Adrian's story without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small leather notebook. "I did some preliminary digging," Raymond said when Adrian finished. "Gregory Whitmore is not a good man. His real estate company, Whitmore Development Corp., has been under federal investigation for multiple fraudulent schemes, but he's slippery, always manages to have someone else take the fall. Like he tried to do with me," Adrian said. "Exactly like that. This pattern, setting up vulnerable people to take blame for his crimes, I think it goes back years. But you're the first one where the frame job fell apart." Raymond leaned forward. "If you're serious about this, I can help you build a case, not just against him, but to expose the whole system that let this happen." "I'm serious," Adrian said without hesitation. "What do I need to do?" Over the following weeks, Adrian became consumed with the investigation. Raymond taught him how to track financial records, how to find patterns in public documents, how to connect seemingly unrelated pieces of information. They discovered that Whitmore had used similar tactics before, filing false insurance claims, blaming break-ins and thefts on employees or contractors who couldn't afford to defend themselves. One victim was a young woman named Lucia Ramirez, who had worked as a housekeeper for Whitmore 3 years earlier. She'd been accused of stealing jewelry and had pleaded guilty to avoid trial, serving 18 months in prison. When Adrian and Raymond tracked her down, she was working at a laundromat, her life still in ruins from the conviction. "I didn't take anything," Lucia told them, her voice barely above a whisper. "But my public defender said if I went to trial, I'd get 5 years. I had a daughter to think about. So I took the plea. The jewelry was never stolen," Raymond explained to her gently. "Whitmore filed an insurance claim, collected the payout and kept the jewelry. We found evidence that he sold several pieces to a private collector 2 years later." Lucia's face crumpled. "You mean I went to prison for nothing? I lost custody of my daughter for nothing?" Adrian felt that familiar rage building inside him. "We're going to make this right," he promised her. "All of it." "You did." They found 2 other victims, a contractor named Benjamin Shaw, who had been blamed for construction defects that Whitmore himself had cut corners on, and a young accountant named Priya Mehta, who had been framed for embezzlement when she'd started asking questions about irregularities in Whitmore's books. With Raymond's help, Adrian compiled everything into a comprehensive file. They had financial records, witness statements, evidence of a pattern stretching back nearly a decade. Teresa Yang connected them with a federal prosecutor named Alexandria Brooks, who specialized in white-collar crime. Alexandria was a formidable woman in her early 40s, known for her tenacity and her perfect conviction record. She met with Adrian, Raymond, and Teresa in her downtown office, surrounded by case files and legal texts. "This is solid work," Alexandria said, after reviewing their evidence. "We've been trying to build a case against Whitmore for 2 years, but he always manages to stay one step ahead. The pattern of using innocent people as scapegoats, this could be what finally brings him down." "What happens now?" Adrian asked. "Now, we build an airtight case. We'll need testimony from all the victims, forensic accounting of his financial records, everything. It's going to take months, maybe longer." Alexandria looked directly at Adrian. "And I need you to be the face of this case. Your story, what he did to you, how close you came to being convicted for a crime that never happened, that's what will make a jury understand the full scope of his criminality." Adrian felt the weight of that responsibility settle on his shoulders. "I'll do whatever it takes." The investigation expanded rapidly. Federal agents raided Whitmore's offices and homes, seizing computers, financial records, and documents. The news coverage was intense. The story of the falsely accused man who had uncovered a decade-long criminal conspiracy became national news. But with that attention came pushback. Whitmore hired an army of expensive lawyers who immediately went on the offensive, claiming Adrian was engaged in a malicious prosecution of his own, seeking revenge for his lawful arrest. Right-wing media outlets picked up the story, framing Adrian as a criminal trying to destroy a successful businessman. Death threats started arriving at Naomi's apartment. "Maybe we should back off," Naomi said one evening, showing Adrian a particularly vicious message that had been slipped under her door. "This is getting dangerous." Adrian stared at the message, his jaw tight. "That's exactly what they want. They want me to be scared, to give up, to go back to being invisible. But I can't. Not when there are people like Lucia and Benjamin and Priya who never got justice." Pastor Graham, who had become a regular presence in Adrian's life, offered a different perspective when they talked later that week. "Justice and vengeance aren't the same thing, Adrian. I'm worried about what this crusade is doing to your soul." "My soul?" Adrian laughed without humor. "Pastor, they stole 6 months of my life. They tried to steal my entire future. And they've been doing it to people like me for years, knowing we don't have the resources to fight back. If wanting to stop that makes me vengeful, then so be it." "I'm not saying don't fight," Pastor Graham said carefully. "I'm saying don't let the fight consume you. Don't let it make you into something you're not." Those words stayed with Adrian, even as the case continued to build. Alexandria Brooks and her team worked tirelessly, and by early autumn they were ready to bring formal charges. Gregory Whitmore was indicted on 43 counts, including fraud, insurance fraud, perjury, witness tampering, and conspiracy. His son Elliot was charged as an accessory. The trial began on a cold November morning. The federal courthouse was packed with reporters, victims, and curious onlookers. Adrian sat in the gallery with Naomi, Lucia, Benjamin, and Priya, all of them finally getting their day in court. Gregory Whitmore looked diminished in his defendant's seat, his expensive suit unable to hide the way he'd aged over the past months. Gone was the confident businessman who had looked at Adrian like he was nothing. Now he looked like what he was, a desperate man facing the consequences of his actions. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Alexandria Brooks walked the jury through each victim, each false accusation, each calculated decision to destroy someone's life for profit. When it came time for Adrian to testify, he walked to the stand with his head held high. "Mr. Foster," Alexandria began, "can you tell the jury what it felt like when you realized you'd been framed?" Adrian took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "It felt like drowning. Like no matter how hard I fought, how loud I shouted that I was innocent, no one could hear me, because they'd already decided who I was, based on where I came from, what I looked like, what my background was. Mr. Whitmore knew that. He chose me specifically because he thought I'd be easy to destroy. And how did that make you feel?" "Angry," Adrian said simply, "and determined. Because if it could happen to me, it could happen to anyone. It probably already has happened to countless others who weren't lucky enough to have DNA evidence that proved their innocence." The defense attorney, a slick lawyer named Garrett Hammond, tried to rattle Adrian during cross-examination, suggesting he was motivated by money, by fame, by a desire for revenge. But Adrian remained calm, his answers measured and honest. "Mr. Foster," Hammond said with barely concealed contempt, "isn't it true that you've already filed a multi-million-dollar civil suit against my client?" "Yes," Adrian said, "but that's not why I'm here. I'm here because Gregory Whitmore is a predator who uses the justice system as a weapon against people who can't defend themselves. I'm here because Lucia Ramirez deserves justice, because Benjamin Shaw deserves justice, because Priya Mehta deserves justice. The money doesn't change what happened to us." Over the course of 3 weeks, the prosecution built an overwhelming case. Financial experts testified about Whitmore's fraudulent schemes. Insurance investigators explained how he'd manipulated claims. Each victim told their story, painting a picture of systemic abuse of power. When the jury retired to deliberate, Adrian found himself back on those same courthouse steps where he'd stood months earlier, newly freed. Naomi joined him along with the other victims. "Whatever happens," Lucia said quietly, "thank you for fighting for us, for seeing us." "We saw each other," Adrian corrected. "That's what people like Whitmore don't understand. They think we're alone, easy targets, but we're not alone. We never were." The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous, guilty on all 43 counts. Gregory Whitmore showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, but his son Elliot broke down in tears. Judge Christopher Morrison, who presided over the federal trial, addressed Whitmore directly before sentencing. "Mr. Whitmore, you didn't just commit fraud. You weaponized the justice system against innocent people. You understood that certain individuals, people without resources, without social capital, without power, would be presumed guilty simply because of who they are. And you exploited that ruthlessly. This court sentences you to 23 years in federal prison." Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Adrian and the other victims. Adrian made a brief statement, one he'd prepared carefully with Alexandria's guidance. Today, justice was served. But let's be clear about something. I was lucky. Lucky that DNA evidence existed. Lucky that I had a public defender who believed in me. Lucky that a private investigator and a federal prosecutor were willing to dig deeper. Most people who get caught in systems like this aren't that lucky. We need to ask ourselves, how many innocent people are in prison right now because they didn't have what I had? How many lives have been destroyed by a system that presumes guilt based on poverty, race, or background? This verdict is a start, but it's only a start. The questions came fast after that, but Teresa Yang stepped in, guiding Adrian away from the microphones. They found a quiet corner of the courthouse atrium, away from the chaos. "You did it," Teresa said, and Adrian was surprised to see tears in her usually stoic eyes. "You actually did it." "We did it," Adrian corrected. "None of this happens without you believing in me on day one." "So, what's next for you?" Teresa asked. "You've got the civil settlement coming. That should be substantial, given the criminal conviction. You could go anywhere, do anything." Adrian looked back at the crowd of reporters, at Lucia and Benjamin and Priya standing together, supporting each other. "I want to help people like us," he said slowly, the idea forming as he spoke. "People who get caught in the system with no way out. I want to start an organization, something that connects falsely accused people with investigators, lawyers, resources, something that makes sure no one has to face this alone." "That's a big undertaking," Teresa said, but she was smiling. "Then I guess I better get started." 18 months after his exoneration, Adrian stood in a renovated storefront in the Riverside district. The sign above the door read, "The Foster Initiative, advocating for the falsely accused." It had been Naomi's idea to use his last name, a way of reclaiming something that had been used against him for so long. The office was small, but functional. Raymond Cho had agreed to come on as the director of investigations. Teresa Yang served on the board of directors, volunteering her time to review cases. And Lucia, Benjamin, and Priya all worked as victim advocates, using their own experiences to help others navigate the nightmare of false accusations. Their first major case came from an unexpected source. A woman named Yolanda Freeman reached out after seeing Adrian's story on the news. Her 19-year-old son, Dante, had been convicted of armed robbery 3 years earlier, based solely on eyewitness testimony. He was serving a 15-year sentence, but Yolanda had never stopped believing in his innocence. Adrian and Raymond took the case, diving into the investigation with the same intensity they'd brought to exposing Gregory Whitmore. They discovered that the eyewitness had been coerced by police, threatened with her own arrest if she didn't identify someone in a lineup. The real perpetrator had been caught committing a similar crime in another state, and DNA evidence linked him to Dante's case. It took 11 months, but they secured Dante's release. The day he walked out of prison, Yolanda fell to her knees in gratitude, and Dante, now 22 years old, 3 years of his life stolen, looked at Adrian with an expression of profound understanding. "How do you do it?" Dante asked quietly. "How do you move forward after something like this?" Adrian thought about that question, about the journey he'd been on since that day in courtroom 7B when the DNA results had changed everything. "You don't move forward," he said honestly. "You move through. You let it change you, but you decide how. You can let it make you bitter, or you can let it make you someone who stands between the system and the next person it tries to destroy." Over the next 2 years, the Foster Initiative grew. They took on cases across 3 states, securing exonerations for 12 individuals who had been wrongly convicted. They testified before legislative committees about criminal justice reform. They trained public defenders on how to spot false accusations and coerce testimonies. They built a network of investigators, attorneys, forensic experts, and advocates, all dedicated to fighting for those the system had failed. Adrian himself became a reluctant public figure. He gave talks at law schools, at community centers, at criminal justice conferences. He was always honest about his anger, about the trauma of his experience, about the fact that some days he still woke up feeling like he was back in that jail cell, presumed guilty by a world that never gave him a chance. But he also talked about hope, about Naomi, who had never stopped believing in him, about Teresa, who had fought for him when it would have been easier to push him toward a plea deal, about Raymond, who had used his skills to seek truth rather than convictions, about the community that had welcomed him home and given him a foundation to rebuild his life. One afternoon, nearly 3 years after his exoneration, Adrian received a call from an unexpected source. Judge Victoria Brennan, the judge who had initially dismissed him as just another criminal. She asked if he would meet with her, and though he hesitated, he agreed. They met at a coffee shop near the courthouse. Judge Brennan looked older than Adrian remembered, tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. "Thank you for meeting with me," she said. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," Adrian admitted. "What do you want, Judge?" She took a breath. "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you accountability. What I did in that courtroom, the way I looked at you, the assumptions I made, that was wrong. And it wasn't just about you. It was about every defendant who stood before me. I started questioning everything after your case. And I've requested a transfer to administrative duties. I'm working with a judicial reform committee to develop training on implicit bias, on the presumption of innocence, on how judges can check their own prejudices. I wanted you to know that your case changed something, at least for me." Adrian studied her, this powerful woman who had once held his fate in her hands. "That's good," he said finally, "but it doesn't undo what happened." "No," she agreed, "nothing can undo it. But maybe we can work to make sure it happens less. I know you're doing that work with the Foster Initiative. I want to help, if you'll let me." It would have been easy to tell her no, to hold on to the anger and betrayal he'd felt when she'd looked at him like he was nothing. But Adrian had learned something over the past 3 years. Holding on to anger only hurt himself. Moving through the trauma, using it to create change, that was how he survived. "Okay," he said, "let's talk about what that help looks like." Judge Brennan became an advisor to the Foster Initiative, using her position within the judicial system to advocate for reforms from the inside. She was harsh in her self-criticism, often speaking publicly about her failure in Adrian's case and what it had taught her about the flaws in the system. The civil case against Gregory Whitmore's estate was settled for $4.7 million. Adrian used most of the money to establish an endowment for the Foster Initiative, ensuring the organization would have sustainable funding for years to come. He kept enough to buy a small house in Riverside near Naomi's apartment and to finally have some financial security. On the 5-year anniversary of his exoneration, Adrian stood before a crowd at the annual Justice Reform Summit, a gathering of activists, attorneys, formerly incarcerated individuals, and policymakers. He had been asked to give the keynote address, and as he looked out at the hundreds of faces, he felt the weight of everything that had brought him to this moment. 5 years ago, he began, a judge looked at me and saw just another criminal. The prosecutor saw an easy conviction. The system saw someone disposable, someone whose life didn't matter enough to question a convenient narrative. They were all wrong, but here's the thing. They were only wrong about me because DNA evidence proved they were wrong. How many people are sitting in prison right now for crimes they didn't commit, without that evidence? How many lives have been destroyed by a system that presumes guilt based on poverty, race, or circumstances of birth? He paused, letting the question settle over the room. I was lucky. Lucky in ways that shouldn't be necessary. Lucky to have a sister who never stopped fighting for me. Lucky to have a public defender who actually listened. Lucky that biological evidence existed to prove what I'd been saying all along. I was innocent. But justice shouldn't require luck. It should be a guarantee. A right, not a privilege reserved for those with resources and connections. The work we do, all of us in this room, it's about eliminating luck from the equation. It's about building a system that actually lives up to its promise of innocent until proven guilty. It's about seeing the humanity in every person who stands accused, regardless of their background or circumstances. Because until we do that, we're not delivering justice. We're just delivering punishment to those who can't afford to defend themselves. The applause was thunderous, but Adrian barely heard it. He was thinking about that day in courtroom 7B, about how close he had come to losing everything. About Lucia and Benjamin and Priya and Dante and all the others the Foster initiative had helped. About the ones they hadn't reached yet, still trapped in the system, still waiting for someone to believe them. After his speech, people lined up to talk to him, to share their own stories, to ask for help. Each conversation was a reminder of why the work mattered, why giving up was never an option. Late that night, back at his house in Riverside, Adrian sat on his porch with Naomi. She had brought over dinner as she did most Sunday evenings, and they ate in comfortable silence, watching the neighborhood settle into evening. You ever think about that day? Naomi asked. The day the DNA results came back. Every day, Adrian admitted. How could I not? It was the day my life could have ended or could begin again. And sometimes I'm not sure which one happened. What do you mean? He struggled to articulate what he'd been feeling. The person I was before my arrest, he's gone. That Adrian Foster who was just trying to get by, who believed the system would work if you just followed the rules. He died in that jail cell. I'm someone different now, someone harder maybe, but also someone who knows what he's fighting for. Naomi reached over and took his hand. You're not harder. You're clearer. You know who you are now, and you know what matters. That's not the same as being hard. I just wish... He trailed off, not sure how to finish the thought. You wish it hadn't happened, Naomi said gently. You wish you could have become this person without the trauma. I wish that too, Adrian. But we don't get to choose our paths. We only get to choose how we walk them. They sat together as darkness fell, two people who had survived a system designed to discard them, who had built something meaningful from the wreckage. Tomorrow, Adrian would go back to the Foster initiative. There would be new cases, new fights, new opportunities to stand between the powerful and the vulnerable. But tonight, he let himself simply be present, grateful for the second chance he'd been given, determined to ensure others got the same opportunity. 5 years had passed since the DNA test results silenced that courtroom. 5 years since Judge Brennan had looked at him with new eyes and seen not just another criminal, but a human being who deserved justice. 5 years of rebuilding, fighting, growing, and healing. The road ahead was long. The system's flaws were deep and institutional. But Adrian Foster was no longer a powerless defendant standing before a judge's bench. He was a force for change, armed with hard-won wisdom and an unshakable commitment to making sure that no one else would have to depend on luck to prove their innocence. And in the end, perhaps that was the true justice, not just his exoneration, but the transformation of his pain into purpose, his trauma into a shield for others. The judge had dismissed him as just another criminal, but the DNA test had proven something far more important than his innocence. It had proven that he mattered, that his life had value, that he deserved to be heard. That truth, once nearly destroyed, had become the foundation upon which he built everything else. The morning air carried the crisp edge of early autumn as Adrian parked his car outside the State Correctional Facility in Greenville, 3 hours north of Riverside. Beside him sat a young woman named Kenji Nakamura, their newest investigator at the Foster Initiative. She was brilliant with forensic analysis, a former crime lab technician who had quit after witnessing too many corners being cut, too much pressure to deliver results that confirmed detectives' theories rather than seeking objective truth. "You ready for this?" Adrian asked as they gathered their materials from the back seat. Kenji nodded, though her expression was uncertain. "I've read the case file a dozen times, but reading it and meeting him are different things." "They are," Adrian agreed. "Remember, he's been inside for 7 years. 7 years of being told he's guilty, of watching appeals get denied, of having his family slowly give up on him. We might be his last hope, but we're also just 2 more people making promises. Stay honest with him about what we can and can't do." They were here to meet Isaiah Washington, a 34-year-old man convicted of vehicular manslaughter in the death of a teenage girl named Amy Brennan, no relation to the judge. The case had received significant media attention because Amy's father was a police captain. Isaiah had maintained his innocence throughout, claiming he wasn't even in the state when the accident occurred, but his alibi had fallen apart when the witness he'd relied on recanted their testimony. The Foster Initiative had received Isaiah's case file from his sister Tamara 3 months ago. Something about it had immediately caught Raymond's attention. Inconsistencies in the accident reconstruction, questions about the timeline, and a suspicious gap in the surveillance footage that should have captured the vehicle. Raymond had worked the case quietly, and what he'd found was troubling enough to warrant Adrian's personal involvement. Inside the prison's visiting room, Isaiah sat at a metal table, his hands folded in front of him. He was tall and lean, his hair showing premature grey at the temples. His eyes held that particular wariness Adrian recognized, the look of someone who had been disappointed too many times to allow himself hope. "Mr. Washington, I'm Adrian Foster, and this is Kenji Nakamura. We're with the Foster Initiative." "I know who you are," Isaiah said quietly. "My sister showed me the news articles about your case, about what you're doing now." He paused. "But I've had lawyers before. They all promised they'd find something, and they all left with nothing." "We're not lawyers," Adrian said, sitting across from him. "We're people who've been where you are, or close enough to understand, and we don't make promises we can't keep. What I can tell you is that we've found some things in your case that don't add up. Whether that's enough to get you out, I don't know yet, but we're going to find out." Over the next hour, they walked through Isaiah's story. He had been in Ohio visiting his dying grandmother when the accident occurred in their home state. His cousin, Trevor Washington, had been with him and had initially confirmed the alibi. But during the trial, Trevor had suddenly claimed he'd been mistaken about the dates, that Isaiah had actually left a day earlier than Trevor remembered. "Why did he change his story?" Kenji asked. Isaiah's jaw tightened. "Trevor had some trouble, drug possession charge. The prosecutor offered him a deal, testify about the dates being wrong, and they'd reduce his charges. He took it. Can't say I blame him entirely. He had kids to think about." "And the physical evidence," Adrian pressed. "The accident reconstruction placed a vehicle matching yours at the scene. My car was stolen 2 weeks before the accident. I reported it to the police. But when they found it abandoned 3 days after the accident, suddenly that report disappeared from the system. Isaiah leaned forward, and for the first time, Adrian saw anger break through his careful composure. They needed someone to blame. The victim's father was Captain Douglas Brennan. You think they were going to tell him they couldn't find who killed his daughter? So they found me, a black man, with a prior misdemeanor for marijuana possession, driving a car that matched the description, with an alibi that they managed to break. Convenient. Kenji glanced at Adrian, and he could see she was thinking the same thing he was. This sounded horribly familiar. After the meeting, they drove back to Riverside in thoughtful silence. Finally, Kenji spoke. The timeline is wrong. I ran the numbers 3 times. Even if Isaiah left Ohio when Trevor claimed he couldn't have made it back in time for the accident, the drive is 11 hours and there's only a 9-hour window, which means either Trevor was lying about the new timeline or someone convinced him to lie, Adrian said. We need to talk to Trevor Washington, and we need to find out who really stole Isaiah's car and where it was during those 2 weeks. Back at the Foster Initiative office, Raymond was already ahead of them. He had obtained the original police report about Isaiah's stolen vehicle, a report that had mysteriously vanished from official records, but that Raymond had found in a retired officer's personal files. The officer, a man named Gerald Kowalski, had kept copies of all his cases, and he'd been troubled enough by the report's disappearance to hold on to it. Gerald's willing to testify, Raymond said, spreading the documents across the conference table. He says the report was definitely filed, and he personally took Isaiah's statement. 2 days later, his supervisor told him to remove it from the system, said it was a clerical error, a duplicate entry, but Gerald knew that wasn't true. Who was the supervisor? Adrian asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew the answer. Captain Douglas Brennan, Raymond confirmed. Amy's father. He was overseeing the investigation into his daughter's death, which should have immediately disqualified him, but apparently no one questioned it. Teresa Yang, who had joined them for the case review, shook her head in disgust. A father investigating his own daughter's death with the power to manipulate evidence. This is a disaster. It gets worse, Kenji added, pulling up security footage on her laptop. I found the surveillance video from the gas station near where Isaiah's car was found. Watch this. The grainy footage showed Isaiah's distinctive blue sedan pulling into the gas station. A figure got out, definitely not Isaiah. The person was shorter, broader, and moved with a distinct limp. Can you enhance it? Adrian asked. Already did. Look at this. Kenji zoomed in on the person's jacket. There, clearly visible, was a security company logo. I ran the logo. It belongs to Sentinel Security Services. They provide guards for various businesses in the area, including, let me guess, Teresa interrupted. They provided security for the facility where Isaiah's car was being stored after it was reported stolen. No, Kenji said. Better, or worse, depending on how you look at it. They provide security for the police evidence facility, and one of their employees, a man named Derek Paulson, matches this build. He also has a documented limp from a workplace injury 3 years ago. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. If Derek Paulson had access to the police evidence facility, he could have taken Isaiah's car, used it in the accident, and then returned it to be found later. But why? Raymond was already pulling up information on his tablet. Derek Paulson, 38 years old. And look at this. He has a juvenile record that was sealed. But I have a contact who can access sealed records. 2 days later, they had their answer. Derek Paulson's juvenile record showed multiple incidents of reckless driving and a vehicular accident that had resulted in serious injuries when he was 16. The records also showed that Douglas Brennan, then just a patrol officer, had been involved in the investigation. Paulson's family had connections, and the charges had been reduced to a minor infraction, keeping him out of juvenile detention. So Brennan knew Paulson had a history, Adrian said, pieces clicking together. When Amy was killed, maybe he suspected Paulson but couldn't prove it. Or maybe Paulson came to him, confessed, asked for help. Either way, Brennan needed a scapegoat, and Isaiah was it. We need to talk to Paulson, Teresa said, but we have to be careful. If he's involved, confronting him directly could make him run or destroy evidence. They brought their findings to Alexandria Brooks, who had moved to the local district attorney's office after her success in the Whitmore case. Alexandria listened to their evidence with growing concern. "This is explosive," she said finally, "but it's also complicated. Douglas Brennan retired 2 years ago and moved to Florida. Paulson still works for Sentinel Security, and Isaiah's conviction is 7 years old. Courts don't like reopening old cases without extraordinary evidence. The surveillance footage showing someone else driving Isaiah's car isn't extraordinary," Adrian challenged. "It's not definitive. The defense will argue it's too grainy, that it could be anyone, that the timestamp might be wrong." Alexandria held up a hand to forestall his objection. "I'm not saying I don't believe you. I'm saying we need more. We need Paulson's confession, or we need physical evidence linking him to the actual accident, or we need Trevor Washington to recant his testimony and explain why he lied. Then that's what we'll get," Adrian said with determination. Raymond took point on investigating Derek Paulson, using his old contacts and considerable skills to build a picture of the man's life. What emerged was troubling. Paulson had been involved in 3 separate vehicular accidents since Amy's death, all while off duty, all resulting in property damage but no serious injuries. Each time, the investigating officers had been unusually lenient, and Paulson had faced minimal consequences. "He has protection," Raymond concluded. "Someone in the department is still covering for him. My guess is Brennan still has influence, even in retirement." Meanwhile, Adrian and Teresa went to Ohio to find Trevor Washington. They located him living in a modest apartment in Cincinnati, working construction. When they knocked on his door, Trevor's face went pale. "I knew someone would come eventually," he said, letting them in. "I've been waiting 7 years for this conversation." Trevor's apartment was sparse but clean, with photos of his 3 children prominently displayed. He offered them coffee, his hands shaking slightly as he poured. "Tell us what really happened," Adrian said gently. "Why did you change your testimony about Isaiah?" Trevor sat down heavily, his shoulders slumping. "They came to me the week before the trial. Detective Barnes and another guy I didn't recognize. They had photos of me buying drugs. I was using heavy back then, trying to cope with my mom dying. They said they could charge me with trafficking based on the quantity, that I'd lose my kids, that I'd do 10 years minimum." But they offered you a deal," Teresa prompted. "They said if I corrected my memory about when Isaiah left Ohio, they'd make it all go away. They even told me what to say, that I'd been confused because of the stress of Mom being sick, that Isaiah had actually left a day earlier than I first remembered." Trevor's voice cracked. "I told them Isaiah couldn't have made it back in time, even with the new timeline, and they said not to worry about that, that the important thing was creating reasonable doubt about his alibi." "Why didn't you come forward after?" Adrian asked. "Because I'm a coward," Trevor said bitterly. "Because I was ashamed. Because I convinced myself that maybe Isaiah really did do it, that maybe I was remembering wrong, that maybe they had other evidence. I'd lied to myself for 7 years while my cousin rotted in prison for something he didn't do." "Will you testify?" Teresa asked. "Will you tell the truth now, even knowing it means admitting to perjury?" Trevor looked at the photos of his children. "Those kids have been asking why they never see their uncle Isaiah. I've been telling them he's away, that he'll come back someday. I want that to be true. So yeah, I'll testify. I'll face whatever consequences come from that." With Trevor's agreement to recant his testimony, they had one piece of the puzzle, but they still needed something connecting Paulson directly to the accident. That's when Kenji made a breakthrough. She had been analyzing the accident scene photos with forensic software when she noticed something unusual. The damage pattern on the vehicle didn't quite match the official reconstruction. She brought in an independent accident reconstruction expert, Dr. Helena Vasquez, who had testified in dozens of high-profile cases. Dr. Vasquez studied the photos for 3 days before delivering her assessment. This reconstruction is wrong, deliberately wrong. The angle of impact, the distribution of damage, the pattern of the broken glass, all of it indicates the vehicle was traveling at a different speed and from a different direction than stated in the official report. Moreover, there are tool marks on certain components that suggest the vehicle was manipulated after the accident to create a false damage pattern. "Can you prove that in court?" Adrian asked. "I can prove the reconstruction is wrong. Whether I can prove it was deliberately falsified, that's harder, but yes, I can testify that this accident could not have happened the way the prosecution claimed at trial." They now had 3 pillars: Trevor's recantation, the surveillance footage of someone else driving Isaiah's car, and expert testimony that the accident reconstruction was fraudulent. It was enough for Alexandria to petition for a new trial. The hearing was scheduled for December, nearly 8 months after Adrian had first met Isaiah. The media coverage was intense. Another potential wrongful conviction, this one involving a police captain's daughter and allegations of evidence tampering. Captain Douglas Brennan issued a statement from Florida, denying any wrongdoing and calling the allegations a witch hunt against law enforcement. The night before the hearing, Adrian couldn't sleep. He walked through the Riverside neighborhood, past closed shops and quiet homes, thinking about Isaiah Washington and the 7 years he'd lost. Thinking about Amy Brennan, a 16-year-old girl who deserved justice for her death, but whose memory had been used to imprison an innocent man. Thinking about all the interconnected failures that had allowed this to happen. His phone rang. It was Raymond, and he sounded energized. "Derek Paulson just turned himself in," Raymond said without preamble. "He walked into Alexandria's office 2 hours ago with his own attorney and confessed to everything." Adrian stopped walking. "What?" "He's been having a breakdown, apparently. Therapy, medication, the whole thing. His therapist convinced him he needed to come clean. He confessed to driving recklessly the night Amy Brennan died, to hitting her with Isaiah's stolen car, to going to Captain Brennan in a panic. He says Brennan convinced him they could pin it on Isaiah, that Isaiah was no great loss to society anyway. Those were his words. Is it recorded? Signed statement, video recorded confession, everything. Alexandria says it's airtight. She's already filing to vacate Isaiah's conviction. He could be out by the end of the week." Adrian felt his knees weaken, and he sat down on a nearby bench. What about Brennan? Paulson's statement implicates him directly in evidence tampering, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Florida authorities are already moving to arrest him. The district attorney up there is furious. Apparently Brennan's been consulted on several cases since retiring. If he was corrupt, it calls all of those into question. After hanging up, Adrian sat on that bench for a long time, watching the sky begin to lighten with approaching dawn. 7 years. Isaiah Washington had lost 7 years of his life because a corrupt cop decided one black man's freedom was an acceptable price to pay for covering up another man's crime. The hearing 3 days later was brief. Judge Christopher Morrison, the same judge who had sentenced Gregory Whitmore, reviewed Paulson's confession, Trevor's recantation, and the expert analysis of the accident reconstruction. His ruling was swift and unequivocal. Isaiah Washington's conviction was vacated, and he was to be released immediately. Isaiah walked out of prison into a cold December afternoon, where his sister Tamara waited with her arms open. Adrian and the team from the Foster Initiative stood at a respectful distance, giving the family their moment. Later, after the press conferences and the tearful reunions, Isaiah sought out Adrian. They stood in the parking lot of the correctional facility. Both men who had been inside those walls for crimes they didn't commit, now standing on the outside as free men. "I don't know how to thank you," Isaiah said. "You gave me my life back." "You never lost it," Adrian replied. "It was taken from you. There's a difference. Now you get to reclaim it on your terms." "What do I do now? I've been inside for 7 years. My kids barely know me. My wife divorced me. My job is gone. How do I start over?" Adrian understood that fear intimately. One day at a time, one decision at a time. And you don't do it alone. We have resources, counseling, job placement assistance. It's not perfect and it won't be easy, but you're not alone. Isaiah nodded slowly. "I want to help. Others, like me, like you, can I volunteer with the Foster Initiative?" "We'd be honored to have you," Adrian said, "but take some time first. Reconnect with your family. Figure out who you are outside of prison. The work will still be here when you're ready." The Isaiah Washington case brought renewed attention to the Foster Initiative and to the broader issues of wrongful convictions. Douglas Brennan was arrested in Florida and extradited back to face charges. His trial was set for the following year. Derek Paulson pleaded guilty to vehicular manslaughter, evidence tampering, and conspiracy, and was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Ironically, less time than Isaiah had already served for a crime he didn't commit. As winter deepened, Adrian found himself reflecting on the path his life had taken. 5 years since his exoneration, and he had helped free 15 people who had been wrongly convicted. 15 lives reclaimed. 15 families reunited. It felt significant, but it also felt like drops in an ocean of injustice. One evening, as he was locking up the office, his phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number, but something made him answer. "Mr. Foster? This is Officer Gerald Kowalski. I was the one who provided the stolen vehicle report for the Washington case." "Officer Kowalski, yes. Your testimony was crucial. Thank you for coming forward." There was a long pause. "I'm calling because I've been going through my old files, all the cases I worked over 30 years on the force, and I found three more where evidence disappeared, where reports were altered, where I was told to look the other way. All of them involved Captain Brennan." Adrian's pulse quickened. 3 more potential wrongful convictions? "I think so. And if Brennan did it 5 times that I know about, how many times did he do it that I don't know about? How many people are in prison right now because of him?" "Send me everything you have," Adrian said. "Every file, every note, every memory. We'll investigate all of them." After hanging up, Adrian stood in the darkened office, surrounded by case files and evidence boxes and photos of the people they'd helped. 3 more cases. At least 3 more innocent people whose lives had been stolen. And Gerald Kowalski was right. If Brennan had done it 5 times, there were almost certainly more. The work was never finished. For every person they freed, there were dozens more still trapped in the system, waiting for someone to believe them, to fight for them, to uncover the truth that would set them free. But Adrian wasn't deterred. If anything, he felt reinvigorated. This was his purpose, forged from his own suffering and refined through years of fighting for others. He thought about that moment in courtroom 7B when the DNA results had been revealed, when Judge Brennan had looked at him with new eyes and seen his humanity for the first time. That moment had changed his life, but not in the way anyone might have expected. Yes, he had been freed, had won his civil case, had built an organization that made a difference. But more than that, he had learned a fundamental truth. The system was broken, but people could fix it. One case at a time, one truth revealed at a time, one life reclaimed at a time. He locked the office and walked out into the cold night. Tomorrow, he would start investigating Gerald Kowalski's 3 cases. Tomorrow, he would continue the fight. But tonight, he would go home to his small house in Riverside, maybe call Naomi and see if she wanted to grab dinner. Maybe sit on his porch and appreciate the simple freedom of being able to do so. 5 years ago, a judge had dismissed him as just another criminal. Then DNA test results had silenced the courtroom and changed everything. But the real transformation hadn't happened in that courtroom. It had happened in the days and months and years that followed. as he had chosen to transform his pain into purpose, his injustice into advocacy, his suffering into service. The judge had been wrong about him. The prosecutor had been wrong. The system had been wrong. And Adrian Foster had dedicated his life to proving just how wrong they could be, one exoneration at a time, until the day when no one else would have to depend on luck and DNA evidence to prove their innocence. Because justice shouldn't require luck. It should be a guarantee, a right, a promise that society keeps to all its members. And until that day came, Adrian would keep fighting, keep investigating, keep standing between the powerful and the powerless. That was his true verdict, the one that mattered most. Not guilty, not broken, not defeated, just a man who refused to let injustice have the final word. If you found this story powerful and want to hear more true stories about justice, redemption, and people who refuse to give up, please subscribe to this channel, hit the like button, and share this video. Your support helps us bring more of these important stories to light. Thank you for watching, and remember, everyone deserves to be seen, to be heard, and to be believed.